I wonder the groups of people in our society that are the most offensive to the church, that community. What if God decided to move amongst that community? Would I be ready? Would I be offended? Would I be open? Would I be willing to learn from them? Would I be willing to receive what they have received from God in order that I would grow? Let's look at verse 12. All of the believers were meeting regularly at the temple in the area known as Solomon's Colonnade. Why is that significant? Why is it significant that they were meeting in Solomon's Colonnade? This is just an open airway, a long kind of passageway with columns on either side that was simply an area in the outer courts of the temple. Why is this place significant? Solomon's Colonnade was one of the only places where Gentiles were allowed to go. It was such a public and intentional sign that they said, we are going to meet in a place where other people who have been othered, are able to access. Revival, my first point is this, revival is always accessible to the marginalized and to the common. Revival is always accessible to the marginalized and to the common. We see that again and again and again throughout revival history, and it began here. It began here where it was highly offensive to mix. It was highly offensive to worship alongside a Gentile. It was highly offensive. And so what they did was they didn't change their religion, right, quote unquote. They stayed in the synagogue. They still worshiped Yahweh, but they began to worship in the outer courts, following the rules so that the Gentiles could join them. And remember, people are being added constantly to this gathering. So it's a very public, very common space for everyone, where the high priests, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees would have to walk by and see this gathering. It wasn't something that was secret or exclusive or elusive or locked away or hidden. It was right there on the ground. The Pharisees had access and the beggars had access. Revival is always accessible to the marginalized and the common. Charles Finney in the Second Great Awakening, I love this story about him walking into a cotton mill. Has everybody heard this story? He walks into a cotton mill. Yeah. Renee's like, oh, I know this one. It's a factory. He walks in and they say that he was so filled with the power of the Holy Spirit that the people that he walked by began to shake. They began to shake, and they describe, this is the funniest thing that they describe, that an onlooker wrote down this moment, which seems like nothing. All it is Charles Finney looking at a woman. That's it. That's all it is. But she is trying to compose herself. She's trying to do her work. All he's doing is being there. He walks in and he looks at her, and she's trying to sew. She's trying to thread the needle, and she begins shaking and shaking. She can't compose herself. So she just loses it. She breaks down. And then suddenly the manager of this cotton mill gets on the speaker and says, shut down every machine. And he's quoted to say, it is more important that our souls should be saved than that this factory run. Like, these were factory workers. This was a seamstress. The kind of money they made was like peanuts. This is where the Lord allowed Charles Finney to go. Like, these are the spaces, these are the places where the Lord loves to dwell. The places where people will say yes. The places where people haven't thought their way into some kind of, elitist chamber. The places where people can just say yes and just receive. The Azusa Street Revival in 1906, it was a revival amongst blue-collar workers. How many of you actually know that they actually lost, so there are all these stories about limbs being grown out. Have you heard these stories? Yeah. Literally limbs being grown out in real time in front of people with all kinds of crazy missing limbs. Now, did you know that most of the time they were missing limbs because they were lost in dangerous work in factories? Like, these were the immigrants. These were people who were rejected from other churches. These were poor people. My dad always likes to say the Azusa Street Revival and the Assemblies of God began with the kids from the wrong side of the tracks. These are the people that the Lord chose to use. It was offensive. It was public. It was right there in a bustling city where black women would teach and preach, where black men would receive from a white man, like where black men and white men and even Hispanics and Asian immigrants at that time, in smaller numbers, but they were there. There's some proof that this was a revival for anyone and everyone. The Jesus movement in the 1960s, it was hippies, the people who weren't even wearing shoes. Like, where does God desire to move? He just wants hearts that are open. I was wondering, and I was like making these comments to Will, like I wonder the groups of people in our society that are the most offensive to the church. I'm looking at them. I'm wondering, that community. What if God decided to move amongst that community? Would I be ready? Would I be offended? Would I be open? Would I be willing to learn from them? Would I be willing to receive what they have received from God in order that I would grow? Revival after revival after revival starts with accessibility to the marginalized and the common.